Welcome to the first episode of this Literary Therapeutic Special Series. Perhaps you are listening early in the morning when the day is still soft. Perhaps in the evening when the world grows quieter. Perhaps while walking, sitting or resting. Wherever you are here. And that is enough. This season is inspired by a work older than our present moment, yet astonishingly precise in how it reaches into it. The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, published in 1895 by Gustave Le Bon. We approach this text not politically and not ideologically, but literary therapeutically. Excuse my English. As a mirror, as a space for reflection, as an invitation to sharpen your perception. We ask, how do collective states affect us? How do they shift our perception? And how do we find our own voice in the midst of these movements? Before we enter theory, we open an inner space, a place you can return to in every episode. Overview of the content of this episode. This episode introduces the psychology of the crowd, not as a historical theory, but as a living pattern that shapes both our inner and outer experience. It follows a calm dramaturgical movement from an inner scene to Le Bon's core ideas, to the question of how we find our own voice within collective dynamics. Key themes of this episode. An inner scene as the starting point of perception. Le Bon's foundational ideas about the collective mind. Psychological mechanisms such as anonymity, emotional contagion, suggestibility and simplification. Modern resonance spaces, digital environments, families, teams, spiritual groups. The question of self-responsibility within collective fields. A meditation on reconnecting with your own inner voice, and a recap of the central concepts explored in this episode. For those who absorb content more easily when listening and reading at the same time, the transcript of the audio episode, for example on YouTube, can be activated manually. It supports not only people who are hard of hearing or learning the language, but also those who process complex material more clearly when they can follow it in parallel. This reading script expands the transcript with a full dramaturgical structure, additional reflective prompts, and a deeper conceptual elaboration. Chapter 1. Inner Scene. The Place of Voices. You stand in a wide square, an open, permeable space full of movement. People pass by, some quickly, some slowly, some absorbed in themselves, some loud. Voices weave into a background hum that is not loud but present. Footsteps, breaths, brief glances, small gestures. A constant coming and going, a rhythm surrounding you. You take a few steps, your breath shifts, your posture shifts. Something in you aligns, not consciously, not deliberately, but like a reflex. A subtle pull outward, a quiet inclination to go along, a barely noticeable impulse to adapt. Perhaps you feel a slight restlessness, a pull in your chest, a wish to blend in, even though no one demands anything of you. It is not pressure, not coercion, not force. It is a field that acts, a collective tone that becomes noticeable within you. You stop. And in the midst of this movement, something else appears. A stillness. Not around you, the world continues moving, but within you. A stillness that is awake. A stillness that is clear. A stillness that gathers you. You feel your body. You feel your breath. You feel yourself. A sentence rises, quiet, almost weightless. This is not entirely me. It is not loud, not dramatic, not rebellious. It is simply perception. A small, precise awareness that something in you has shifted. And then another awareness follows. Something else is speaking through me. The moment lingers in your body like an echo. Something in you knows that this subtle movement is not random, but part of a larger pattern. To understand what has just taken shape within you, we take one step back and look at how the crowd becomes a psychological organism. Chapter 2. The intention of this series. The moment from the inner scene lingers for a while. A quiet echo in the body. Something in you knows that this subtle shift is part of a larger pattern. To understand it, we take a step back and look at the psychological landscape in which it appears. This series approaches the psychology of the crowd, not as a political argument and not as a historical curiosity, but as a living psychological pattern that continues to shape our inner and outer experience. It is inspired by Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, 1895, a work whose observations reach far beyond its time. The intention of this series is to create a space where you can explore these dynamics without pressure, without ideology, and without the demand to take a position. Instead, it invites you to observe, gently, clearly, and with inner distance. Le Bon's ideas are not used here as doctrine. They serve as an orientation, as a lens through which certain movements become visible. The pull of collective emotion, the softening of personal boundaries, the shift from individual perception to collective feeling. These movements are not abstract. They appear in families, teams, digital spaces, spiritual groups, and in the quiet moments of everyday life. This series offers a literary therapeutic approach, a way of reading, listening and perceiving that strengthens your inner voice while you move through collective fields. It does not tell you what to think. It helps you notice what happens within you when collective dynamics arise. Le Bon writes, The individual in the crowd is no longer himself. He becomes an instrument of the collective mind. This sentence is not a warning. It is a description, a way of seeing the subtle shift that happens when the self becomes permeable to the emotional field around it. Le Bon himself was not a psychologist in the modern sense, but an observer of collective behavior, fascinated by the ways in which individuals change when they enter a shared emotional field. His work is not a manual and not a moral judgment. It is a study, sharp, provocative, and deeply attentive to the movements between the individual and the collective. This series takes his observations as a starting point, not as a conclusion. Reflection prompt. Where do I feel the subtle shift from my own perception to the tone of the group? A moment of clarity often appears here, a small recognition that prepares the ground for the next step. The intention is simple: to give you a space where perception becomes clearer, where inner orientation becomes steadier, and where the subtle movements between self and collective become visible. Chapter 3: Accessibility and Inclusive Design. Accessibility is not an addition for this format. It is a part of its foundation. This series is designed so that different ways of perceiving, learning, and processing information can coexist. It supports listening, reading, co-reading, and the use of assistive technologies, allowing each person to move through the material in the way that feels most natural. Some listeners follow the audio alone. Others activate the transcript to read along. On YouTube, the transcript can be opened manually, offering a clear, structured way to follow the spoken text. This supports not only people who are hard of hearing or learning the language, but also those who process complex material more clearly when they can see and hear it at the same time. The structure of the script, with short sections, clear headings, and a calm rhythm, supports cognitive accessibility. It reduces unnecessary load and allows the content to unfold at a steady pace. The language is intentionally clear without being simplified, so that the conceptual depth remains intact while still being approachable. Le Bon notes that words in a crowd do not carry their usual meaning. They become signals that shape emotion. This observation also reminds us that clarity of language is not merely stylistic. It is a form of orientation. When concepts are presented with precision and calmness, they become easier to grasp, even within complex psychological landscapes. For those who are learning the language, the combination of audio and text create a dual channel of perception. Hearing the tone while seeing the structure. This can make abstract and emotionally charged material easier to absorb and can support a more grounded understanding of the psychological concepts explored here. Reflection prompt. How do I perceive most clearly? Through listening, through reading, or through both at once? A small awareness of your own learning rhythm can make the next chapters feel more grounded and more spacious. A gentle clarity often appears here. A recognition that prepares the transition into the psychological landscape of the collective mind. Chapter 4: Le Bon and the Psychological State of the Crowd. To understand how collective dynamics arise, it is helpful to clarify Le Bon's foundational perspective. He does not describe the crowd as a physical gathering of people, but as a psychological state that emerges when individuals begin to attune to one another's internally. This state is not visible like a group of bodies. It is felt like an emotional field forming between people. Le Bon writes, "In the crowd, the conscious personality fades. A collective soul emerges." He does not mean this as a mystical sense, but as a shift in inner order. The individual steps back, and a shared emotional tone steps forward. This state does not arise from the number of people present, but from their synchronization. People begin to feel similarly, react similarly, judge similarly. The crowd becomes a psychological organism that influences its members, often quietly, often unnoticed, yet with unmistakable effect. Le Bon describes several characteristics of this state. The first is emotional dominance. Feelings spread more quickly and more powerfully than thoughts. They move like a spark, jumping from body to body. A frown, a laugh, a tone of voice. Each can generate a mood that transmits instantly. The crowd does not respond to arguments. It responds to atmospheres. Emotion becomes the primary point of orientation. A second characteristic is suggestibility. In collective situations, external impulses are taken up more easily. People become more receptive to moods, opinions, or impulses that do not originate within themselves. This heightened receptivity is not a weakness. It is an expression of the human capacity for resonance. But in the crowd, this resonance becomes amplified, more immediate, faster, less reflected. A third characteristic is simplification. Complex situations are reduced to clear images. Ambivalence loses space. The crowd prefers definite forms, good or bad, right or wrong, us or them. This simplification is psychologically relieving because it creates orientation. Yet it distorts reality by removing nuances that would be natural for the individual. Another characteristic is impulsivity. Reactions become more immediate, more spontaneous, less considered. The crowd acts faster than the individual can think. This impulsivity arises from emotional dynamics, when feelings dominate and simplification takes hold. Action becomes the direct extension of emotion. Finally, Le Bon describes diffusion of responsibility. In the crowd, the individual feels less responsible for what they do or say. Action becomes collective action. Responsibility becomes collective responsibility. The I recedes. The we steps forward. This process is subtle but powerful. It explains why people may become bolder, more impulsive, or more complained in groups than when alone. These characteristics are not moral judgments. They describe a psychological dynamic that emerges wherever people synchronize emotionally, in political movements, families, teams, spiritual groups, and digital spaces. Modern examples. In social media, collective moods arise within minutes. Outrage, euphoria, fear. In teams, people absorb stress or optimism without consciously choosing it. In families, role patterns persist that no one has explicitly defined. In spiritual groups, a shared tone emerges that feels like truth. In political movements, complexity is reduced in favor of clear enemy images. These examples show how subtle and yet powerful collective dynamics can be. They do not begin in large crowds, but often in small everyday moments that seem insignificant. But it is precisely there that inner work begins, not in states of exception, but in the fine shifts we barely notice in daily life. Reflection prompt. Where have I recently noticed my perception adjusting to a mood faster than I could consciously decide? A quiet awareness of these movements prepares the ground for understanding the mechanisms that shape them, and why they reach so deeply into our psychological experience. Chapter 5: Psychological Mechanisms of the Crowd. The characteristics of the crowd state show how perception and behavior shift when people begin to attune to one another internally. To understand this dynamic more clearly, it is helpful to look at the mechanisms that make this state possible. Le Bon does not describe them as moral categories, but as psychological processes that intensify in collective situations. A central mechanism is anonymity. Within the crowd, the individual feels less visible and less clearly identifiable. This felt anonymity allows people to behave in ways they would not display when alone. Not necessarily more extreme, but more spontaneous, more immediate, less controlled. Inner inhibition decreases because responsibility no longer rests solely on the individual. A second mechanism is emotional contagion. Feelings spread through groups more quickly than thoughts. A shared laugh, a moment of outrage, a collective impulse. All of this moves through the group before anyone consciously reflects on it. Emotional contagion is a basic principle of social interaction, but in the crowd it becomes amplified, more immediate, more encompassing. A third mechanism is suggestibility. People become more receptive to external impulses when they are part of a collective state. Words, gestures, moods, or symbols exert stronger influence. Suggestibility does not mean that people become without will. It means they respond more quickly to external signals because their inner distance is reduced. Another mechanism is simplification. The crowd prefers clear images, definite messages, and reduced forms. Complexity is pushed aside in favor of comprehensibility. This simplification is psychologically relieving, but it alters perception. Ambivalence loses space, and nuanced judgments become less frequent. Finally, there is a diffusion of responsibility. The stronger the collective state, the less the individual feels like the sole acting agent. Responsibility spreads across many shoulders and behavior shifts accordingly. People act more boldly, more impulsively, or more adaptively because they experience themselves as part of a larger whole. These mechanisms explain why people behave differently in groups than when alone. They appear not only in political or historical masses, but in everyday situations where people attune to one another emotionally. Modern examples. In online discussions, inhibition decreases because anonymity and emotional contagion interact. In work groups, people absorb moods that are not their own. Stress, optimism, skepticism. In family roles, patterns persist that no one consciously chose, yet repetition stabilizes them. In spiritual or therapeutic groups, a shared tone emerges that offers orientation, but can also become suggestive. In political debates, complex issues are reduced to simple images that spread more easily. These examples show how ordinary and yet powerful these mechanisms are. They do not arise only in large crowds, but often in small moments. In conversations, in digital spaces, in moods that spread unnoticed. This is where inner work begins, in recognizing the subtle shifts that shape our perception. Reflection prompt. Which of these mechanisms affects me most strongly? Anonymity, emotional contagion, suggestibility, simplification, or diffusion of responsibility. A quiet awareness of these processes prepares the transition into understanding how these dynamics become visible in the present, and why modern resonance spaces intensify the effects of the crowd. Chapter 6. Modern Resonance Spaces. The mechanisms of the crowd do not only appear in historical or political mass events. They also emerge in spaces that seem ordinary, yet carry enormous psychological influence. These spaces are not defined by size, but by their resonance capacity, by the speed with which moods, impulses, and evaluations spread. A central resonance space is digital communication. Platforms such as social media generate collective states that can form within seconds. The combination of anonymity, emotional contagion, and simplification intensifies the dynamics Le Bon describes. A single comment can trigger a mood that spreads across hundreds or thousands of people before anyone consciously reflects on it. Another resonance space is the workplace. Teams develop emotional tones that influence all members. Stress, optimism, skepticism, or exhaustion do not remain isolated. They function as collective fields. People adapt, often without noticing. The crowd here does not arise from numbers, but from shared alignment. Families are also resonance spaces. Roles, expectations, and unspoken rules act like collective patterns that continue across generations. No one needs to articulate them. They emerge through repetition, synchronization, and emotional contagion. The crowd appears here as an inner inheritance that shapes perception and behavior. Spiritual or therapeutic groups form resonance spaces as well. They can offer orientation, but they can also become suggestive. The shared tone that develops can be strengthening or constraining if it is adopted without reflection. The dynamic is the same. People attune to one another, and a collective state emerges. Finally, political and societal discourses are resonance spaces. Complex topics are reduced to clear images that spread more easily. Emotional dominance, simplification, and diffusion of responsibility are particularly strong here. The crowd does not arise only in the streets, but also in narratives that repeat and reinforce themselves. Modern examples. In social media, mood spreads faster than facts. In teams, a basic climate forms that shapes behavior and decisions. In families, patterns persist that no one consciously chose. In spiritual groups, a shared tone emerges that offers orientation, but can also become suggestive. In political debates, complex issues are reduced to simple images that circulate more easily. These examples show how ordinary and yet powerful modern resonance spaces are. They do not arise only in exceptional situations, but in everyday life, in conversations, in digital environments, in moods that spread unnoticed. This is where inner work begins, in recognizing the subtle shifts that shape our perception. Reflection prompt. In which resonance space do I most clearly feel my perception adjusting to collective moods? A quiet awareness of these spaces prepares the transition into understanding how we can rediscover our own voice within these dynamics and what role self-perception plays in that process. Chapter 7. Finding one's own voice in the collective field. The previous chapters have shown how collective states arise and which mechanisms shape them. Yet, the essential focus of the series does not lie in analyzing the crowd, but in understanding how we orient ourselves internally when we become part of such dynamics. The crowd is a psychological state, and so is the self-perception that gives us stability within it. One's own voice is not a fixed object. It is a process that forms anew in every moment. It emerges where perception, experience, and inner stance meet. In collective situations, this inner voice becomes quieter, not because it disappears, but because other tones grow louder. Expectations, moods, roles, impulses. The challenge is to make one's own voice audible again, without disconnecting from the group or positioning oneself against it. A central step is discernment. What belongs to me and what belongs to the field? This question is not moral but perceptual. It directs attention to the subtle differences between inner impulse and outer resonance. Often we feel the reaction of the group first, and only afterward our own. The sequence reverses. Our own voice does not weaken, but it appears later. Another aspect is slowing down. Collective dynamics accelerate perception and action. The crowd reacts faster than the individual can think. One's own voice becomes audible when we create an inner moment in which we do not respond immediately. This moment does not need to be long. It only needs to be conscious. A single breath can be enough to restore inner order. Inner distance is also essential. It does not mean withdrawal or separation, but a clear view. Distance creates space for perception. It allows us to sense the mood of the group without being fully carried by it. This distance is not a protective wall, but an orientation point. Finally, self-responsibility plays a central role. In collective states, responsibility spreads across many shoulders. One's own voice becomes audible when we remember that we remain acting individuals, even when the group influences us. Self-responsibility does not mean opposing the group, but knowing one's own position within it. These aspects show that one's own voice does not stand in opposition to the crowd. It emerges within the crowd, in the moment we perceive ourselves while being part of a collective field. Modern examples. In meetings, a shared tone often shapes decisions before anyone has articulated their own position. In digital spaces, people adapt to moods that are not their own. In circles of friends, we take on roles we never consciously chose. In spiritual contexts, a shared tone can be strengthening or overshadow personal perception. In political discussions, one's own voice becomes quieter when collective emotions dominate. These examples show how common the challenge is, finding one's own voice within collective fields. It does not arise without withdrawal, but through conscious perception of what moves within us and around us. Reflection prompt. When did I last notice that my own voice appeared only after the mood of the group? And how might I have sounded if I had given it space earlier? A quiet awareness of this question prepares the transition into the inner practice, a short, clear exercise that helps us rediscover our own voice within a collective field, not as separation, but as orientation. Chapter 8. A short inner practice. One's own voice does not become louder in collective fields by withdrawing from them, but by creating a moment in which we perceive ourselves again. This practice is not a ritual and not a meditation in the classical sense. It is a short, clear exercise that helps restore inner order when external dynamics grow stronger. Sit comfortably or remain standing just as you are. This is not about posture, but about attention. Take one breath without changing it. Notice how the body rises and falls. This breath is the first point of orientation. It belongs to you. It is not collective, not adopted, not influenced. It is an inner rhythm that remains independent of external moods. Now bring your attention to the area behind your forehead, where the thoughts arise. Not to control them, but to notice what is present. It may be quiet. It may be restless. It may be diffuse. All of it is fine. The aim is not to change anything, but to perceive what is happening within you before you respond to external impulses. Shift your attention to the chest area. Notice whether there is tension, pressure, pulling, or perhaps spaciousness. This area often responds first to collective moods. It shows whether you are adapting, joining, or withdrawing. Perceive what is there without evaluating it. Now, ask yourself a simple question. What within me belongs to me? And what belongs to the field? Do not force the answer. It often appears as a feeling, a clarity, a small shift. Sometimes it appears as silence. This silence is not withdrawal, but an orientation point. It marks the moment in which your own voice becomes audible again. To close, take another breath, not deep, not deliberately guided, simply as it comes. This breath is the transition back into everyday life. It reminds you that you can return to this inner point at any time, even in the middle of a group, a conversation, or a digital dynamic. This practice is short, yet effective. It creates a moment of inner clarity that is not directed against the crowd, but offers orientation within it. Modern examples. In a meeting where many voices act at once, a single conscious breath helps you rediscover your own position. In online discussions, a moment of inner distance can prevent you from being pulled into the dynamic. In family conversations, a brief inner check helps you avoid slipping into old roles automatically. In group settings, a conscious pause creates space before you are carried by the mood. In social situations, the question, "What belongs to me?" clarifies your inner stance. These examples show that inner practice does not consist of long exercises, but of short moments of conscious perception that fit into everyday life. Reflection prompt. Which small inner action, a breath, a thought, a brief moment of perception, helps me most to rediscover my own voice? With this inner practice, we now turn to the question of how the central concepts of this episode come together, and which core ideas accompany us into the next chapter. Chapter 9. Integration of central concepts. This episode has shown how collective states arise and how they influence our perception. The following concepts summarize the central ideas from the core of what we carry forward from this chapter. Collective state. The crowd emerges through inner synchronization, not through numbers. Collective soul. A shared emotional tone that overlays the individual. Emotional dominance. Feelings act faster and more strongly than the thoughts. Emotional contagion. Moods transmit immediately between people. Suggestibility. External impulses are taken up more easily. Simplification. Complex situations are reduced to clear images. Impulsivity. Reactions become more immediate and less reflected. Diffusion of responsibility. Responsibility spreads, the I recedes. Anonymity. A sense of reduced visibility after behavior. Resonance spaces. Digital, social, and familiar fields amplify collective dynamics. Inner distance. A conscious moment that creates orientation. Own voice. An inner reference point that helps distinguish what belongs to me and what belongs to the field. Inner practice. Short, clear steps to make one's own voice audible again. One thought remains. The crowd is not an external condition, but an inner process, and one's own voice is the place where orientation begins. Closing remarks. This concludes the first episode of this series. If you wish, you can listen to or read individual chapters again to deepen certain concepts or repeat the inner practice. Each episode is designed to stand on its own while also forming part of a larger whole. Thank you for taking this time for yourself. Perhaps something from this episode will accompany you through the day, the week, or simply this moment. You decide what you carry with you and what you leave behind. We will meet again in the next episode. Calm, clear, and with an open view toward what moves within us. Note for independent reading. If you feel the desire to explore the original text more deeply, you can also read The Crowd, a study of popular mind by Gustave Le Bon. For this series, I work with the public domain German translation by Rudolf Eisler from 1908, alongside the original edition. Publication note. This script of this episode will soon be available as a digital edition for purchase. If there is positive resonance and sufficient interest, the complete special series Psychological of the Crowd original edition will be published as a book-on-demand release. This publication will include a revised, consistently structured version of all the episodes as well as additional materials. Support note. This channel is created in my free time, by me alone, with care, research, and attention to detail. If you would like to support my work or listen to my content on other platforms, you will soon find me on Spotify, Ko-fi, and later on PayHub. Every form of support, a subscription, sharing the content, or a small contribution helps me continue producing these formats. Disclaimer. This format is not a therapeutic offering. The content of it serves literary psychological reflection and critical engagement with social and historical concepts. It does not replace psychological, medical, or therapeutic advice and is not intended as guidance for self-diagnosis or self-treatment. All described phenomena, terms, and inner scenes are analytical and literary representations, not individual recommendations. For personal or health-related concerns, it is strongly advised to consult qualified professionals. The author assumes no liability for decisions or actions taken based on the content of this series. This script is a work of Kulturerbe Archivarin. All texts, meditations, and imaginations exercises are protected by the copyright. Use is permitted for private purposes only.